Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, a partnership with the Hastings County Historical Society and Belleville Public Library. My name is Shannon Bryan, and I'm a librarian at Belleville Public Library. My co-host from the Historical Society today is Richard Hughes. We are here to hear Jim Kennelly speak about the early history of Tyendinaga Township. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we will be using the chat feature in Zoom for any questions or comments you may have. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat feature throughout the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat and I will ask your questions at the end of Jim's presentation. If you experience any technical issues, you can also submit them via the chat feature. Without further ado, I'll pass this along to my co-host, Richard, who will introduce our speaker today. Off to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to a very interesting afternoon. Jim Kennelly, my colleague and friend for a long time. He's what I call a true Tyendinaga lad. He was born on a farm in Marysville, or New Marysville, for a very large family, and he now lives in retirement in the very beautiful village of Lonsdale. And I might just digress to say that if you're ever out on a spring day when the lilacs are in bloom, drive through Lonsdale. It is the most magnificent scene and a beautiful location. But anyways, getting back to our guest speaker. Yeah, Jim was a teacher and administrator with the Algonquin Lakeshore Catholic District School Board for many years. And then after retirement, he stayed on as a trustee and a vice chair and then chair of that school board. So he has a great deal of knowledge and background in education. Now Jim is what we call fully retired. However, can I assure you that he's certainly not busy. During the first and foremost, he and his wife Sandy enjoy the wonderful family of 4 daughters and 12 grandchildren, which is the reward of the retirement years. But in his spare time, he manages to keep a very large garden, as we referred to a few moments ago, and he researches genealogy, and he researches also the history of the Township of Tyendinaga. He enjoys memoir writing, and if he's not busy enough with all of this, in his spare time, he enjoys the guitar, golfing in the summer, curling in the winter, and on top of all of that, Jim is a director of the Hastings County Historical Society and very busy there. And in fact, he organizes our guest speakers. And he's chair of the Food for Learning Steering Committee, which is a very important community involvement. So Jim has amazing achievements in his working career as an educator and now in his service to the community. So I look forward to hearing from him his stories from the history of Tyendinaga. Jim?
Thank you, Richard. The Township of Tyendinaga is the proud home of over 4,000 people. It's one of the few municipalities that escaped the amalgamations of the Harris government. It has a community of people that has shown significant growth in the past few decades. Pride and self-reliance are part of the heritage for which Tyendinagans are noted. Today, we have a modern township hall, a thriving library, a fire department equaled by none, and recreational facilities that are the envy of larger municipalities. And as well, we have one of the oldest annual fairs in the province, the Shannonville World's Fair, which is now held at Melrose. Briar Fox Golf Course, the Shannonville Speedway, and Chisholm's Mills form part of the charm that is Tyendinaga. The original beginning of the township lies in the land grant of Tyendinaga to the Mohawks under the chief John Deseranu. The large area and the small band of Mohawks who inhabited the territory created an area of pristine woodland between the developing populations and cleared land of Richmond Township to the east and Thurlow Township to the west. No doubt, the pressures and memories of the War of 1812 created a situation and a desire to develop a good road traversing the southern part of Ontario. As well, the front townships along Lake Ontario had developed good-sized populations, so roving eyes began to look elsewhere for economic opportunity. A sale of land occurred on July 20th, 1820 by the Mohawks. You can see on this map here The area bounded by yellow to the left and right, to the north and the south, is the area that, well, I should say, first of all, the entire township at one time was part of the Tyendinaga Reserve, part of the Mohawk Tract, part of that area that was given to the Mohawks in thanksgiving for their loyalty to the crown during the American War of Independence. This land that we're seeing bounded by yellow was sold in 1820. How that happened, its rightness or wrongness, is not a topic for this presentation, but it did involve the sale of the middle part of this territory. It would allow an ability to build a road system going from east to west. The Noble and Kiefer lease of land in Shannonville in 1818 and the attractiveness of economic development along the Salmon River were probably keys to the purchase. If you look at this geographic block of land, it's about 8 kilometers from north to south, and you can see that the Salmon River enters that block of land in the upper right-hand corner, and it leaves down towards Shannonville. So it traverses this entire little block. It's a rather large area if you're looking for the building of a road. But most likely there was an understanding that this area, because of the Salmon River, offered economic opportunity. It was an ideal setting for those who want to build mills and businesses along a river. So we have communities like Shannonville, Milltown, Maher's Mill, which was now Waddingham Valley, Lonsdale, and Kingsford form along this river. Those businesses would only be successful if there was a hinterland of populated farms to feed the bottom line. Whether it was developing a road or the economic opportunities of the river, there's no evidence for the rationale of the purchase. But no matter what, the deed was done. We are told that the Mohawks reluctantly allowed a survey of the first 4 concessions. So it seems to indicate some concern on the part of the Mohawks for the way the sale was conducted, but that's just conjecture on my part. One of the first sale of land in 1820 was not the success that was envisioned, and the population grew slowly. In Caniff's book, Pioneer Life on the Bay of Quinte, he noted that John Port claimed there were only 27 inhabitants in 1826. Others set the population as high as 353. This population census in 1824 noted that there were 352 residents of Tyendinaga. The unknown question is, did this include the population on the Mohawk Tract? The other question is whether John Port's number was talking about inhabitants or the actual number of families in possession of lots. This is the first page of an inspection done in 1829. The reality is, in 1829, it shows the presence of 39 families. Were there more that were missed? Were there squatters that were not identified? Squatting was common throughout the early history of the township, in the north, in the south, in the east, and the west. Some squatters were situated on clergy or crown reserves, waiting for the opportunity for them to open up. In 1830, Tyendinaga separated from Thurlow. The population was noted as 370 inhabitants. 87 of them were men over the age of 15. So, allowing for sons living with their families, the number of possessors of lots was not extensive. The following year, 1831, the population grew to 620. You can see the Tyendinaga on this census down at the second from the bottom. It had doubled to 1,160 in 3 years. And in 4 years, it had nearly tripled. This is the muster roll for the 1st Regiment of Hastings Militia. It included men from Tyendinaga and Shannonville, and gives us a fairly good sense of who was in the township and where they were located, because you can see that it gives the age of the men, and it gives their lot numbers that they were living on. It met at Shannonville under the captaincy of George Bleecker and Ensign John H. Bleecker. The three sergeants were John and George Port and Michael Nayland. 198 men from the ages of 16 to 55 were assembled. As well, the list included about 50 men from the Indian tract, most of them seeming not to be Mohawks. It's not clear. It may be that some of these men were already squatting on lands in the Northwest in anticipation of the buying of the Northwest tract in 1835, since some of these men can be found there later. In 1835, the population had grown to 1,443. What were those early settlers doing there to ensure their survival? Likely, as they cleared the land, they were making potash that could be shipped to Montreal and on from there to Europe. Potash was used to clear the sand in the making of glass. As well, it was used in the bleaching of fabric and in making colors fast in printed cotton. A good deal of money could be made at this while clearing the land. After all, what do you do with wood when you have enough for heat and construction? The early settlers would have to burn it to clear the land. If you could use this burnt wood to make a living, it would be a bonus. To be fair, some logging would have been done and floated down the river, while still other wood material would have been gone into the making of roads, the corduroy roads through the lowlands and swamps. And still other lumber like cedar would have been used for the construction of fences, split rail fences and root fences. But with the regular trees, the broad-leaved deciduous trees, the ashes from these trees were collected and placed in a sieve over a trough or a tub. Hot water was poured over the ashes, and the process was repeated until the water was strong enough, alkaline enough to become lye. This was then boiled down in large iron pots until a brownish ash residue remained, or it could be made into a soap for personal use. If you're going to use it to make soap, the lye was mixed with animal fat to make it a soft, serviceable soap. An acre of good broadleaf trees could yield as much as 60 to 100 bushels of ash. That, in turn, would give you 6 to 10 bushels of potash. At $20 to the barrel, this was decent money for a hardworking pioneer. It was a time-consuming task, and it had to be handled carefully. Packed into barrels, it was transported to its destination. And that was pretty difficult because there weren't good roads and bridges at the time. One suspects that in early Tyendinaga, this meant floating the potash down the river to Shannonville or carrying it through the rough roads. The potash was worth a great deal of money, and it took no small effort to get the product shipped. But the potash trade was one way the settlers could get some cash or ready credit. Ready cash was a valuable and not all that accessible a commodity. So in the 1820s and 30s, as our settlers are moving on to their lots, this trade was a major industry in Canada. Here we have William Port's lot in Shannonville. It describes it. And it was a potash works, or an ashery. It was on the Salmon River on a lot 36 by 16 feet, on a lot owned by William Port on the northwest side of Queen Street and west of King Street. It was a water lot. In the Hastings Atlas in 1870s, there was an ashery on the fourth concession in the 18s owned by Owen Roblin. People brought their ashes there and avoided the drudgery and tedium of creating their own potash. So the potash industry remained of some importance for quite a long time in the township. The early pioneers were busy from sunup to sundown in the making of a better life. While the men cleared the land and raised crops of grain, the women and children began the growing of potatoes around the stumps. Peas, beans, carrots, turnips, onions, squash, pumpkins, corn, they were all grown because they could be kept in root cellars over the winter. The greens of spring and wild leeks, wild berries, game in the forest, and fish in the streams and rivers all became a part of the diet of the pioneers. And every family engaged in the making of maple syrup if they had maples on their lot. The potash pot could do double duty. The procuring of food was followed by the never-ending creating of serviceable clothing. Now, can you imagine for these immigrants, many of them from the British Isles, the never-ending labor was compounded by the black flies and mosquitoes, the heat of the summer sun, and the cold of a Canadian winter. But these people tempered all that with the knowledge that their 100 or 200 acre farm was theirs. Their success was determined by their own efforts. They were resourceful. Now, at the time, Shannonville was a major hub for the population. As I mentioned before, Tyendinaga's affairs were first run by Thurlow, but Tyendinaga separated in 1830 from Thurlow. And the first township meeting was held at the Inn of Richard Legier with John Port as the township clerk. Thomas Dorland Appleby became the clerk in 1832 until 1835. His ability is reflected in the securing of the postmaster's task in 1833. And he was also very much the leader during the rebellion of 1837. A caravan of 14 wagons loaded with arms stopped in Shannonville overnight. Appleby and his colleagues, Murchison, Legier, and Bleecker, kept watch overnight. And the Mohawks men themselves were very much a part of that loyal group keeping watch. During the 1837 rebellion, Tyendinaga was generally regarded at the time by Captain Warren as generally loyal, with some bad characters in it. But even Thurlow was even more suspect than Tyendinaga, and it was a place of much more concern, especially in the second and third concessions. That's why they had to maintain the safety of that shipment. The rebellion affected relationships in the township. The harvest in 1837 had been a shambles in Ontario, so there was agitation for reform directed against the family compact. The clergy reserves and the unfairness of the political processes had made its mark on perceptions. In Tyendinaga, George and William Port had lost their barns to arson. And here you can see this is part of the seeking of compensation for the loss of their barns. Michael Nayland, later a clerk of the township and justice of the peace for a number of years, was one of the men arrested for supposedly having rebellious tendencies and taken to Fort Henry. The neighbors and family believed he was going to be shot as a traitor. And a neighbor, believed to have been John Port himself, made the trip to Kingston to speak for him and his loyalty. It had been a case of mistaken identity. By 1837, it's reported that the township had 7 sawmills, a grist mill, 5 taverns, 5 weavers, 2 general stores, a chair factory, a dish turner, a tailor, and 10 schools. There was a beautiful stone Anglican church in Shannonville. The Catholic community was building a similar but simpler stone structure in Marysville. Both of these structures still grace their communities today. New settlers were coming into the northwest section since the purchase from the Mohawks in 1835. Further settlement followed after the northeast was purchased in 1842. And by 1842, the Mohawk tract had been reduced to the lands bordering on the Bay of Quinte. Mills. There were flour, lumber, and woolen mills were eventually all along the Salmon River, beginning in Shannonville at Smith's Mills or Milltown, Maher's Mill in Waddingham Valley. Lonsdale was originally called Legier's Mills, and Frizzell's Mills or Kingsford. In the Northwest, the Moira provided opportunities where Chisholms exist today. Small communities grew around these endeavors, particularly in Shannonville, Milltown, Lonsdale, and Roslyn. Shannonville had a large flour mill, an extensive lumbering operation run by Walbridge that turned out several million feet a year, which was shipped from the docks of Shannonville on flat-bottom boats. It had 2 tanneries, a carriage and a blacksmith, shops, and several good stores. Eventually, it was to have 3 churches to take care of the spiritual needs of the population. This is an example of one of the fine buildings in Shannonville that's still existent today. Milltown, just down the road, also had extensive milling, with the Legiers operating both a sawmill and a flour mill. Appleby and Burdett had a fine flour mill and a sawmill. Robert Pagan had an iron foundry, a machine shop, and a chair factory. This is the woolen mill in Lonsdale before it burnt in 1904. Lonsdale, originally called Legiers Mills, was a center with a sawmill, a flour mill, and a woolen mill. And they sold beautiful fine tweeds out of Lonsdale. All contributed to the economic fabric of the area. Millwrights, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, coopers, molders, lawyers, drapers, merchants, shoemakers, carpenters, masons, teachers, millers, tanners, lawyers, tailors, everybody was in the township. You didn't have to go to Belleville to get your business done. But one of the difficult problems for the early community was the road system. Every fourth or fifth lot was reserved by the clergy or crown. If there was a clergy reserve, it was for the use of the Anglican Church. If it was a crown reserve, it was usually used for educational and road purposes when they were sold. Other lots had been purchased by speculators or given to military men who were hoping to make some money. One example was Thomas Rideout, a prominent member of the family compact in Toronto and associated with the Bank of Upper Canada. These lots, while not occupied, still needed to have roads going by them to be built and maintained. This had to be done by the men in the community doing statute labor. The development of a road would add to the value of the unoccupied lot, but it was not to the advantage of neighbors to have unoccupied lots owned by speculators. It was a source of aggravation in the community. Here in 1842 at the top and 1848 at the bottom, you can get a sense about the religious orientation of the citizenry. You'll see that the Church of Rome refers to the Catholics, Church of England is Anglican, Church of Scotland is Presbyterian. And we have a good sense of the breakdown of the religious orientation within the community. The very early records for the township have gone missing. It's too bad. The tracking of the population through census records, the early assessments, the early records after separating from Thurlow, all are missing. Such a wonderful resource not to be had anywhere. This is the first page of the minute book from record that began to be kept in 1848. Beautiful book now in the possession of the clerk at the Township Hall in Melrose. The earliest record contains some information. The minutes of the council informs us that in 1848, the township meeting was held at the Inn of James Anderson with John Port as chair and John Sweeney. The records state that they were elected by a majority of the 120 voters. They were called district councilmen. By 1850, some 6,200 people resided throughout the township. Every 100-acre lot seemed to have a young family resident. The unfortunate reality is we can't even check that number because the census for the north half of the township is missing. Who were these folks who were coming into the area of Tyendinaga? Well, some immigrants came from the British Isles and they would have come up to St. Lawrence by boat. One of their first stopping off points was Kingston or perhaps Picton for some. Tyendinaga would have been one of the few front townships still available and relatively empty, a township close to Lake Ontario and the Bay of Quinte, therefore fairly attractive to immigrants tired from traveling and ready to build a home and get on with the reality of forging a living. Accordingly, the early marriage and birth records for some Catholic pioneers in the township can be found at St. Gregory's in Picton. Having caught their breath, they were probably directed north by the Picton priest, knowing that they would be safe in a Catholic area with a church. For second and third generation United Empire Loyalist folk, Tyendinaga offered the possibility of settling new lands, but living not far away from the family home in Prince Edward County, Richmond Township, or Thurlow. A good number of the United Empire Loyalist settlers in Tyendinaga originated in Sophiasburg Township, just across the Bay of Quinte. And as well, a large contingent of North Irish Protestants and Scots Presbyterians rounded out the new population. Although it's stated that Catholics went to the east of the township while the Protestant settlers were in the west, that was not a hard, fast rule. Lonsdale, in the east part of the township, is the home of two churches, a Methodist and a Presbyterian, while Ebenezer Church, a Wesleyan Methodist congregation, was on the Deserano Road, just north of the 6th concession. And St. Jude's Anglican spire rose just to the north of Kingsford. These were all in the east of the township. And the other important thing to note is that much of the Irish Catholic population of Tyendinaga was not famine Irish, but they were here early, beginning with John Sweeney in the 1820s. Often the second generation migrated into the northern regions when the new surveys were completed. Or they came in the 1830s and early 40s because of the socioeconomic conditions in Ireland. My ancestor, Dennis Daly, came in 1842, and he settled in the last section purchased between the 7th and 8th concession. Since not all the lots were settled and we had the clergy and crown reserves, there was still some room for famine Irish in 1847. Clara McFerrin, a historian, mentions that there was a colony of unfortunate famine refugees in Shannonville, where bad health, probably cholera, and those illnesses that afflict the weakened followed them. It was related by Martin Kenny, who attended school next door to the church, that for days at a time, the funeral processions came from Shannonville to the graveyard at Marysville, where the victims were buried in unmarked graves. If you look at the records of Holy Name of Mary, it's not apparent, but that's the oral tradition. The Baldwin Act of 1850 formalized the operation of townships across the province. It was this date that Tyendinaga uses to establish its formal beginnings, despite the separation from Thurlow 20 years earlier. For the early council, I think I'm losing, okay. I'm getting ahead of myself here. For the early council, the concerns of roads, schools, and taverns were all consuming. Take yourself back in time. Imagine the state of an early township. Some lots had been settled for a time. Others had just been purchased. There were vacant lots, mostly clergy or crown reserves, or those owned by speculators. Roads through the township had to encounter the realities of rivers and creeks, pesky swamps, steep hills, even cliffs in the vicinity of the Salmon River as it carves its way through the limestone. Development and progress hinged on how well the roads could be used. So monies were used from the sale of crown lands by Hastings County, and they were allotted to the townships for road development. Every concession was divided into work sections. And here we have the different concessions, and each of these men is in charge of a work section on that concession. The path master's task was to organize his section into the creation of and the maintenance of appropriate roads and necessary bridges. Every able man over 21 was required to perform statute labor on the roads, so many days a year at the direction of the council, and it depended on how much assessment you had on your property. The past master's task was challenging. He had to take an oath of office. A list of all the eligible men in his section who are liable to statute labor had to be submitted to the township clerk. He had to receive a list of the labor that needed to be done, and he had to ensure it was completed between June 1st and October 1st of that year. He gave 3 days notice to his section's men. 3 days notice, and you better show up. Unsafe or obstructed roads or bridges were to be repaired. His road list of duties to be performed was to be returned after October 15th, showing the number of days labor, the monies received by those who paid to have somebody else do their work for them, and how it was spent, the amount of labor not performed and commuted, and he was responsible for notifying the justice of the peace for those who had not completed their tasks. The task could be daunting and required a lot of energy and focus, but this These are the, if you want, the leaders of the community. I think it's a good way of saying, okay, who was it that was respected members of each of their areas in the township. And equally, they had to have pound keepers. These were the people who were responsible for making sure that if there was a boar hog or a ram or a bull running around terrorizing the neighbors' livestock, that they could be impounded and that they wouldn't be tearing off into the neighbors' gardens and grain fields and destroying things for other people. Good neighbors make good fences make good neighbors, but pound keepers help to ensure that. The rapid growth of the 1830s and 40s resulted in a huge population of young children in the township. The early pioneers were often young men and women just setting out or had young families, and they were wanting to better their economic well-being. Young children were everywhere. Children were a help in the young community. They could carry and fetch, watch and feed livestock, and provide necessary labor in the clearing of the land. But as the community grew, the demand for education swelled. Early schools soon popped up. By 1837, there were 10 schools. In 1847, we read in historic Hastings that Tyendinaga had 22 common schools in operation. It's an interesting figure when you note that Thurlow and Sydney each had 19. By the mid-1850s, there were 27 school sections, 4 of them which were union schools, which meant that that section was shared with a section outside of the township. These 27 school sections also included the school sections on the Mohawk tract. The township appointed a superintendent of schools in 1850. He was Randall McMichael from Shannonville, and he had to supervise all of the township's schools. The issue of school sections, where each one was, who resided within the section, was a source of frustration for the township council. In October 1853, a notice went out that a meeting would be held to adjust and alter school section boundaries to make school sections more sensible, fair, and geographically appropriate. The council tried to create justice in a sense of school communities, how children were to be able to get to them. New school sections were still being formed. For example, Lonsdale had an early school section, but it seemed to have folded, and a new one was created in 1853, SS 29. And that's the SS 29 to this day, with a few changes. I have to inform you that the issue of families transferring in and out of school sections continued for years in council deliberations. Swamps, flooding roads in fall and spring were not always accounted for in the assigning of a section. As new roads opened and sometimes closed, it was necessary to make further adjustments. In the 1870s, the old schools, usually of log, began to be replaced by structures that spoke of the well-being of the community. In 1856, it was moved by Mr. McLaren and seconded by Mr. Sweeney that the Governor General establish a mart and cattle fair in the Township of Tyendinaga to be held twice a year, in September and February of each and every year, and that the said mart or fair be held in the village of Shannonville in said township. That was the beginning of the Shannonville World's Fair, which, as I said, is now in Melrose. So from 1856, we've had a fair. John Foran was engaged to build a new township hall for the township, so that we would have a township hall that would be in a central position within the township. It was decided that it would be in the Melrose area, and he was our architect. He was an early resident of Tyendinaga. He studied under architecture in New York City in 1851 to 53, and you'll find Alexander Foran eventually moves to Belleville, where he created a number of interesting structures. This is the Township Hall, which eventually became our library. The issue of poverty raised its ugly head in council deliberations. Young families were stricken by the loss of the male breadwinner if he died young. Folk would be without the benefit of family support. There might be sickness in a family, or an abandoned and destitute wife with her children as her husband took off. A decrepit old man, or a man deprived of the blessing of sight. There were orphans and paupers dying who needed to be buried. The issues were ever present for the council. In 1852, they passed a bylaw that the present allowance to paupers be reduced by 1/2 from this date to the 1st of September next, at which time all such allowances shall cease entirely, and that the persons having charge of such paupers be notified of this order, and that was carried. Well, council didn't have a chance to turn its blind eye to the marginalized. Within 2 meetings, they were back to helping with monies for the indigent. The minutes are filled with examples of the necessary charity expended. In 1877, Robert Pagan was paid for 3 coffins for paupers. A dead child was brought to the inn of James Dolman. Burial and expenses were paid. George Stanhope was paid for keeping a foundling. And at least 4 widows were being subsidized. With settlement and development, agriculture predominated. Milk from the family farm would have been made into butter, sometimes cheese, and used for family consumption. Cheese making would have occurred in the township as an individual task by a farmer. However, the cooperative cheese factory emerged in Oxford County in 1864 and rapidly spread across the length and breadth of Upper Canada. The growing of wheat as a crop had predominated as the crop for raising and selling, the crop for making a living. But the growing of wheat could be tough because of a little bug known as the wheat midge. The young of this insect could seriously damage wheat crops, affecting both quantity, quality, and economic livelihood. The cheese factory offered new possibilities. So a large number of cheese factories led to the growth of the dairy industry. Most of these early cheese factories were cooperatives, which were owned by the farmers, who were shareholders in the small companies with a president and a secretary treasurer. The profits were shared according to the amount of shares one had. Here we have a cheese factory at Shannonville. Milk was drawn by horse and wagon. Every driver was paid by the trip, while the cheesemakers were paid by the amount of cheese they made. At first, cheese was only made on the weekdays, but that changed to daily pickup, and cheese was made on Sundays as well. For some of us who are a little older than others, we can remember the stopping in at the local cheese factory to purchase fresh curd, a treat enjoyed throughout the township. Cheesemakers tested the quality of the milk by their smell. If it was off, it was returned to the farmer. Later years resulted in government inspectors being sent around to check on the cleanliness of the factory and its machinery and the quality of the milk being used. To make the cheese, milk was heated and rennet added. The fluid curd was cut and salted and then pressed into cheese. 2/3 of the milk was returned to the farmers as whey, which was used as feed for the resident pigs on the farm. The pressed cheese was allowed to cure, which meant pressure for long periods of time and daily turning. So a curing room was needed. The process took 30 to 50 days. When ready, one of the farmers would haul the cheese in boxes, 30 to 34 at a time, to Belleville. Fortunately, a good supply of these cheese boxes could be obtained from Melrose, where there was a cheese box factory. Cheese factories operated in at least 9 sites in the township: Shannonville, Albert, Rosebud on the Reed Side Road between the 7th and 8th, Melrose, south of the old Township Hall, Mountain on the 2nd concession west of Shannonville Road, and Nathan, Hempy Hill, Roslyn, and on the Deserano Road, south of the 1st concession. Other factories existed just on the outskirts of the township, for example, Kingsford. And I'm told there was a cheese factory north of Rosebud as well, not as well known. The president of the local cheese factory company would sell this cheese every Friday, usually to a company like Cook & Company in Belleville. It found its way to the Belleville dock and was shipped to the USA and England. By 1900, cheddar cheese from the factories of Ontario had captured 60% of the British market. This market remained critical to the success of the factories until 1952, when Britain stopped the importation of cheddar cheese, and that put great pressure on the small factories and led to the beginning of their closings. These cheese factories provided a source of income for both the farmers in the community and a number of men in the community, but it should be noted that the cheese making only ran from spring to fall. Cows were dried up over the winter and only began to milk with the birth of the calves in spring. So most farms had a bull to ensure timely and appropriate conception times. One of the families who was noted for their contributions to this cheese industry was the Brennan family, which included Brennans who were not even aware of how they were related to each other. The subsistence farming that occurred in many places meant that many farmers grew tomatoes for the canning factory as well, that hugged the north side of the river in Shannonville, or in the canning industry in Deseronto. Every farm had a cow stable, a horse stable, a pigsty, and a chicken house, all housed away from each other to keep down diseases among the livestock. Every housewife was engaged in the putting away of preserves, both fruit and vegetables, both preserved and in root form. Salt pork in the brine barrel, and in some instances, sauerkraut in a barrel. Now, this is a list of 15 of the taverns in Tyendinaga in 1875. Taverns were an ongoing issue in the township for years. In 1851, the number of taverns in the township was limited to 20. Now, it was important to have a tavern in different parts of the township because the roads were not good. If you had to go somewhere, you had only so many miles you could do in a day, and you had to be able to have a place to stay at the end of your day. So they were strategically designed to be everywhere in the township. The law in 1851 said there had to be at least 2 rooms on the lower floor, sleeping apartments and beds to accommodate at least 4 persons over and above one's own family, an enclosed yard. I'm sorry, I touched my computer here. Did I get that down to smaller print?
Yeah, you need to click on that icon in the bottom corner, the one that looks like like a TV screen. Yep, right there.
Okay. An enclosed yard of sufficient size, sheds and stabling for at least 6 horses. And after you received your license, you had to have a stone or brick fireplace in the bar or tap room within 6 months. And you had to have a signboard outside your premises, advertising your premises. There were rules to having a tavern. You had to have good order. There were no seditious or immoral books allowed, no drunkenness. You could not open from 11 o'clock until 3 o'clock, and you could have no tippling at other hours. No liquor was for minors unless they were in the presence of or by order of a parent or guardian, and no disorderly conduct. There were inspectors appointed to make sure these rules were carried out. And here in 1875, you can see the 15 taverns that still remained. But by this time, they're on their way out. And we have actually the beginning of, by 1898, there are at least 2, what should I call it? Temperance societies, one in Reed and one just north of Marysville. This was a poem I found at the archives about taverns in Tyendinaga. 17 taverns in Tyendinaga, so the minute books recorded back in the 1850s dig, even if you couldn't afford it. But when you dug and quaffed a liter, your dream girl, you're apt to meet her. Many of them did, and the offspring sprung, still mingle amongst us and among. By Charles Andrew Tupper from Foxborough. Wasn't a very nice comment about Tyendinaga, but there it goes. This is a map of Tyendinaga in 1898. It's quite small on your computer screens, I'm sure, but you can see there's all the schoolhouses are on the map, and churches are located as well. The great divide in the township was the Catholic Protestant divide. This divide was not only religious, but could also be geographic. Even as a young man, when Sandy and I met one of our neighbors in the 1970s who was not from the area, she would ask, "How are things at the Catholic end of the road?" With so many Irish Catholics, a large number of Irish Protestants, mostly from the north, and significant numbers of Scots Presbyterians, English Anglicans, and a large UEL grouping, it did not take long for the Orange Order to find a prominent role in the community, jockeying for power on council, and the positions that were handed out by council was inevitable. The first Orange Lodge in number 3 in Hastings County was formed in Tyendinaga in 1830 by Francis English. The Loyal Orange Lodge stated that the post office for this lodge was Lonsdale in 1830, but there was no Lonsdale in 1830, so I suspect the date is not correct, and that the lodge was in the western part of the township around Shannonville. The second lodge, number 99, was established in 1833 in Shannonville by John Cook, a 16-year-old. He may have been one of the early teachers in the township. He was exalted in 1849 when he was 32. Now, I don't know what exalted means. I think you'd have to ask a member of the Orange Lodge to give you that information. Loyal Orange Lodge 242 received its warrant in 1838 to Walter S. Bowes. He too was a 16-year-old at the time. In 1871, Robert Reed was made a senator, and John White was acclaimed as his replacement as MP for Hastings East. The following year, an election was held. White, a reeve of the township and operator of a cheese factory in Roslyn, an Orangeman originally from County Donegal in Ireland, was prominent in the order, and he was the Conservative candidate. His opposition was Wellington Frizzell, a miller from Frizzell's Mills or Kingsford, who, although not Catholic, was married to a Catholic girl. Tensions ran high in the Lonsdale area. I'm sure they ran high in the entire township. One of White's ardent supporters, John Winters, had a clash over the previous year with a Dominic Tye and James Smith. White went back into the north to check on a poll. Coming back into Lonsdale with some friends, he was met by what is reported to be a crowd of angry Catholics who had been drinking all afternoon. Shots were fired, and Winters was wounded, one of the shots being fatal a few hours later. This was the newspaper headline in the Belleville Intel. Now you have to remember the times. A young family, a husband and wife, had been hanged in Belleville. They had been from the north end of the Hastings County and been brought down to Belleville. A trial had been held, and they were both hanged. So the Intelligencer offered only the victim's story. No account of the other side was published. Meanwhile, the men responsible for the deed went into deep hiding, and it's thought that they escaped by boat into the United States, where they kept on going into the far western reaches. No known account of their whereabouts is known to exist, although I'm told their relatives eventually knew. However, the die was cast, Winters died, and tensions ran high. Some areas of the township were so heavily Catholic that 4 school sections were composed totally of Catholic ratepayers. So with this reality, the bishop, James Vincent Clary, arrived in the township in 1892, a man of much influence in the Catholic community. He was forceful and sharp. Under his guidance, these 4 schools were turned into separate schools. 3 were within Reed Parish's domain. Blocks at the north end of what's now Daly Road at the 8th concession. The school on the 7th, just east of today's Reed Road, the school at Reed Road and Enright Road today, and the fourth was shared between Reed and Marysville on the corner of today's Marysville Road and McCullough Road. When the elections to Township Council were conducted, there was always a quiet checking to see how the balance between the religions was being kept. These days seem to have drifted by us, and I think we're all better off for that. The townships had more than one ghost, and get several of your longtime residents together and you'll hear the stories, but the one I know of is the ghost of a young Walsh who drowned in the Salmon River at Maher's Mill in what we now know today as Waddingham Valley. One of the residents was sleeping in the nude in the shed in the area. He was pushed out of bed. Half groggy, he climbed back into bed. Again, he was pushed from his bed. Wide awake, he climbed back into bed only to be quickly to be dispersed one more time. Realizing something was happening, he fled from the scene. The death of young Walsh was untimely, and because he had not been prepared to die such a violent death, no one would work at the mill. So the priest was brought back to the river to say the appropriate prayers. The ghost was laid to rest, and no more was heard from him. In 1902, great excitement hit the Melrose area with the discovery of an oil well. However, the venture did not pan out, and several people lost some money on their worthless shares of stock. Now, I should say this is a map. I should have mentioned this. Number 9 on this map is where the murder took place in Lonsdale. As families grew and migrated out, many of Tyendinaga's finest went on to pioneer in the western reaches of Canada and the United States. Later, people moved into the manufacturing centers that offered better remuneration than a 100-acre subsistence farm could offer. The mills and small factories slowly disappeared. Here you can see Lonsdale's woolen mill. It had had a fire in 1904, and that was the end of the woolen mill. Beside the substantial structure, beside it is the grist or flour mill, which is still in Lonsdale today. It's a bed and breakfast. An example of the number of people going elsewhere for jobs would be Rochester, where a large number of Tyendinagans moved to take advantage of the manufacturing possibilities there. Some properties, particularly in the Northwest, were just not viable for today's agricultural world. This township's population slipped in the 1950s to a little under 3,000, and farming became regarded as a tedious 24/7 activity, and work in the urban centers continued to beckon. Today, Tyendinaga has a few dairy farms, some cash cropping, and many beef farms. A large chunk of the residents are employed in the town and city centers nearby, Belleville, Kingston, and Napanee. The cost of real estate elsewhere and the peaceful nature of the township has led to a growth in population to over 4,000 today. To treat Tyendinaga's history without commenting on the culture of the party telephone line, the congregants of our churches on a Sunday morning of strawberry socials and parish dances and church suppers, the importance of electrification or the absence of it in some instances, the sense of community found in threshing communities, the impact of the South Hastings Baseball League and juvenile sports on township life, the celebration of coming together on July 1st and the importance of volunteerism. The time just doesn't allow all that. The advent of the Grand Trunk Railroad in 1856 and its stations at Marysville and Shannonville, and the extension of the CPR through the township with its station west of Lonsdale in the 1880s also impacted the life of the community. The history of Tyendinaga is just as much a history of the people who led and guided the community. Thomas Dorland Appleby and his son Nathaniel, who was Reeve for many years and MPP. The Milling Legiers, John White, Reeve and MP. Wellington Frizzell, Michael Nayland. Their stories and impact are extensive. And the less obvious, but just as influential, the pathmasters, the innkeepers, the spiritual leaders, the assessors, the owners of business, their stories have yet to be told. My perspective is just a humble glimpse into what we call our heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. So we're going to open the floor now to any questions that you might have for Jim. And I do see that there is one person, Mary Lynn, and she asked, can you tell me the lot number for Bernard? Oh, just wait 1 second. Bernard McGinnis on the regiment page 3 or 4th, please. I think it was one of your earlier slides,
Yeah.
Jim.
I'll see what I can get. Is there another question while I'm looking that up?
Yep. Linda Murray said, thanks, Jim. Great presentation. My 3 times great grandparents, Reuben Graves and Margaret Mahala Mills, lived on concession 1, lot 15. In 1861, they had 6 children, but 10 years later, he's a widower with 3 daughters. Would love to know what happened to them. Was there a cholera outbreak between 61 and 71? Any ideas of how I could find a record of their deaths?
I haven't. The only thing I could suggest is you go to the death. I don't know. They weren't even keeping death records at that time, were they?
I don't think till about 1867, right?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know that.
I would suggest, Linda, that you take a look at Ancestry. Your local public library would probably have access to Ancestry for free. If not, I know our Belleville Public Library does, and do a quick search for death records for that time and just see if you can find them. And also, I don't know if Tyendinaga Township Public Library has this, but Belleville Public Library has an index of the deaths, birth, marriage, and deaths that were recorded in the Belleville Intelligencer. And we do have an index for that time period. It's possible that they were printed in the Belleville paper. I mean, it would have been a distance away from that, but it's always an option to check. But you can email me directly if you'd like. My email is included on the invite to this presentation, and maybe we can find some answers for you. Going back to the original question, did you find that, Jim? Bernard McGinnis?
Do you know when you want something fast, you can never find it?
Okay. Would you like me to skip to the next question?
Yes, please. I can't seem to find it right off the bat here.
Okay, no problem.
I will find it.
Yep. Patrick said, very interesting presentation. My Callahan ancestors were from Tyendinaga. And Bob and Barb Dawes, I think this is Barbara that said this. My 2nd, 3rd, and 4th great grandparents came from Perthshire about 1844 and settled in Reed and ran the post office. I believe 2 children who died are buried in Reed Cemetery during that 1861 to 1864 time period. So that's really interesting. Mary Starr said, thank you for this excellent and interesting presentation. I'm based in Wisconsin, and I'm wondering where would be the best place I can look for records of my ancestors who lived in the area about 1830 to 1880.
And it depends on what religion were they?
Well, I'll get you back on that response there. She'll have to type it in.
Okay.
Melissa said, very interesting. So many names from the beginning of the township are still there. That is true. Thanks, Jim. And Bob and Barb, again, are just asking, would there be any burial records for the Reed Cemetery?
Yes.
Yes. And how would they access those?
There is, somebody has done a write-up of the tombstones in the Catholic Church cemetery. Usually the Catholic Church records are on FamilySearch.org, but for some reason or other, the Reed records are not on FamilySearch.org, which is too bad.
Okay.
But the Marysville records are on FamilySearch.org, and they're beautiful records. I'm just trying to go this way to find that thing.
Yeah. And getting back to Mary, who was based in Wisconsin, and she was looking for records of her ancestors who lived in the area about 1830, 1880. And she says they were Irish Catholic. So that's the religion.
Yeah. The earliest records for all of Tyendinaga the Catholic records,
Mm.
up until about 1839 are in Belleville at St. Michael's. And then after
Okay.
that, they're in Marysville until 1854.
Okay,
And then
so
in
St. Michael's.
1854, the church splits, and the north end goes to St. Charles and the south end goes to Marysville. But you can get the Marysville records online.
Okay,
This is the document that that person was looking for, Bernard.
oh yes,
McGinnis.
Bernard McGinnis. There he is, age
Concession
32.
1 lot. Yeah,
39.
concession 1 lot 39. That was
Yeah.
the Bernard McGinnis that lived at Marysville. There were other Bernard McGinnises.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
All
so
right,
you got to be
so-
careful.
Okay, so Mary Star says thank you. Bobby Joe says great presentation, Jim. Patrick
Thank you,
says
Bobby Joe.
Patrick says there were two Mert Callahans. My
Yes.
ancestor was born in 1809 and died in 1884. Not sure if he was the pathmaster in 1850. Pathmaster.
If he could send me an email, I've got a lot of that.
Yeah, do you want me to share your email address, Jim?
Please, sure.
It's JE and then your last name, right?
Yes.
And it was at Yahoo?
Yep, that's right.
It's going to share
Because
Jim's
I
email with
suspect I
everybody.
have I suspect I have a relationship to that Mert Callahan.
Okay, so that would be Patrick Goodmurphy. So you'll probably expect an email from him.
Okay.
So everybody, I've included Jim's email there in the chat. So if you want to email him directly, you can do that. Linda Murray says, would concession 1 lot 15, this is the Bernard McGinnis, be closest to Melrose, or which town would it be nearest? Concession 1
Say that one more time.
Concession 1 lot 15. What town would it be closest to?
It would be between Marysville and Shannonville.
Marysville and Shannonville. Okay. I'm going to go back, make sure we've got everybody answered here. In case those of you that came in a little bit later, Melissa was asking if the Historical Society would be having meetings this fall in person, and the answer was yes. So keep an eye out for their website when they get those dates finalized.
Can I say one thing?
Yes.
The concessions run from the lots from west to east. So lot 1 would be on the west side of the township, and lot 40 would be the most easterly lot on that concession. So there are 40 lots between 1 and 40 between the boundaries.
Okay.
So if you're 15, you'd be not quite the middle of the township, but a little to the west a bit.
Colleen says, great presentation. Thanks, Jim. So if you've got any questions or comments, you can type them here, or if you prefer and you want to email Jim directly, his email is Kennelly at yahoo.ca. I don't know if I'm still mispronouncing your last name.
Sure.
And you can always email me directly as well. My email was included in the Zoom link email that you guys would have gotten. Is there any other questions, or if not, we'll wrap things
I have one comment.
Yes, go right ahead.
We started before the pandemic, a group of people interested in putting together material on the history of Tyendinaga Township. So we call it the Tyendinaga Township Project. But the pandemic has kind of put a kibosh on us meeting together and moving forward. Hopefully we'll be able to get that going again. We are probably going to take a look at how this project is going to unravel, or I won't say unravel, come together. And so I think maybe we might be looking at creating a source book of Tyendinaga history. So if people have material that they'd like to send or include, or have stories that they would like, I would be willing to take anything and everything. I'm the chair of the committee, and we're always looking for other ideas. We're not a group of excuse me. We're not a group of experts. We're not a group of professional researchers. So it's what you see is what you get.
Okay, great. So I don't see any other questions. So I'm going to pass this on to Richard in case he has any questions or if he'd like to wrap up. But thank you, Jim.
Yes, just a second while I get my,
We lost him.
Oh, he just turned his camera off.
oh, sorry. I'm trying to get myself back.
Yep, I can hear you.
We can see you.
Oh, can you? Okay, I can't see myself.
Yes.
Okay, well, anyways, yes, the questions were excellent, and indeed, in addition to sending Jim questions, if people have historical questions, they can be sent to also to the Historical Society. We do historical research too, and that's just at president@hastingshistory.ca. But I'm just looking at the Hastings Militia Return list there, and I see my wife's great-great-grandfather listed there. He was at Lot 1, Concession 2 back in the 1840s. So as I say, there's a relevance to so many of us, settlement of Tyendinaga. But thank you, Jim, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Please stay with us, watch for announcements of future Zoom presentations. I believe Shannon would agree. We hope to continue this at least for the next couple of months. And we have so many stories to tell, and it's a very pleasant way to spend an hour in the afternoon. So thank you all for tuning in. Keep an eye on the website of the Hastings County Historical Society. And if you wanted to look at previous of these presentations, and there have been quite a few of them, they are on our YouTube. So it's Hastings History YouTube, and you can find previous ones for your pleasure. So thanks for everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you again hopefully a month from now.